will speak about this theme. Good morning to everybody. I will speak about this theme using the three cycles of the avant-garde, the usual cycles, the historical avant-gardes, neo-avant-gardes, and the retro or post-avant-gardes, which is very suitable for Slovenia, but also for the region of Central and Eastern Europe. I will outline three attempts to revolutionize Periphery-Centre relationship in Central and Eastern Europe, with specific focus on Slovenia and Yugoslavia. The first attempt belongs to time of the historical avant-gardes of the 1920s. The second attempt is linked to neo-avant-gardes of the 1970s, and the third to the post-avant-gardes of the 1990s. Here we have its lithography, Anna, how would you define it? Probably, it is collage, I think, of Chernigov, and it's one which is quite playful, and with Charlie Chaplin. And here we have a self-portrait of August Chernigov, who's a representative of the historical avant-garde. Our hypothesis is, I will first read this. This is a very interesting statement by Chernigov, which is a constitutive statement, which was basically written at the time of this famous exhibition in Trieste of the Slovene constructivists. And he wrote, "We the barbarians are more skillful and artistically gifted than all French, Italian, and German commercial prostitutes," which is really a very nice statement, which speaks about the tactics of the periphery. Darius was speaking about the tactics of Grotowski. Those were the tactics of August Chernigov. He was a good friend of Ljubomir Micic, which also shows why he wrote like that. They were very good together. And this is his friend Ferdo Delak, who was also a film director. My hypothesis is that the second and third cycles of the avant-gardes reenacted and reinterpreted some basic ideas of constructivist and futurist utopian questions, linking them and adapting for new historical and political circumstances. The neo-retro and post-generations were proud to announce that they are the heirs of the artistic generation of the constructivists and zenithists who wanted to promote, and this is interesting, Trieste, which was at that time in a way really the center of the avant-garde, but at the same time, unfortunately, it became also one of the centers of the fascist movement. Ljubljana, Zagreb, Belgrade as the centers of new art to establish a new bridge between East and West, South and North. In addition to this, we will try to explore to what extent the Central European avant-gardes developed thoughts that are close to specific horizontal perspective, which was talked a lot about during those 2 days of art history as defined by Polish theoretician Piotr Piotrowski. To what extent did the three avant-gardes and at the margins of European culture space radically redefine centrality and marginality and undermine the tools of cultural appropriation, so to say. I will use the examples of Ferdo Delak, August Chernigov, Ljubomir Micic in dialogue with Marinetti, Prampolini, Der Sturm for the historical avant-garde. Then for the neo-avant-garde, I will mainly use the example of Lado Kralj, which is less known in this. He's very well known, but he's much less known in his relation to Grotowski, Schechner, Arjan Nuschki. And for the post-avant-garde, I will use the example of Neue Slowenische Kunst, which was discussed also a few times during our symposium. It's impossible to go around them, and why should we go around them, I say. And of course, I will link this Neue Slowenische Kunst to Fluxus American avant-garde, the theater of images, and post-Soviet avant-garde. And I will try to show to what extent, I quote now Diana Mishkova, margins do not merely exist as extensions of the core, end of quotation. How the margins produce a specific autonomy and assert agency through the construction of alternative regional categories. Now, I use this quotation before we saw the Slovene cultural home which was burned by the fascists. So we see that the influence of fascism in Trieste was very much seen. And when Mussolini, he liked to visit this region. When he was in Pula, he stated, when dealing with such a race as Slavic, inferior and barbarian, we must not pursue the carrot, but the stick policy. We should not be afraid of new victims. The Italian border should run across the Brenner Pass, Monte Nevoso and the Danaric Alps. I would say we can easily sacrifice 5,000 counted barbaric Slavs for 50,000 Italians. So basically, this was the atmosphere in which the artist worked at that time. In the map of the Western art, I will start with some basic notions or basic problems which exist between in two interpretations of history of art. One is vertical and the other is horizontal. The map of Western art of the 20th century with Western centers is largely present in the minds of every scholar of modernism and avant-garde. But, however, nothing similar to this exists in Eastern Europe, where the transparent structure of an overarching art history does not exist. No referential system is in place that is accepted beyond the borders of a given country. In my proposition, I will justify this statement by questioning the Periphery-Centre relationship. My initial assumption is that one can no longer regard the hybrid Central European avant-garde idioms discussed and as impure versions of movements that had their authentic expression in the common centers like Paris and Berlin. The examples I concentrate on are coming from the territory of the avant-garde phenomena such as Zenithism, Slovenian constructivism, Dada tank, the early and radical avant-gardes on the territory of the newly formed Kingdom of South Slavs. All the above historical avant-garde movements took the ideas developed by various avant-garde movements, ranging from Italian Russian futurism, from expressionism to Dadaism and other avant-gardes. They eclectically, of course, assimilated some foreign ideas into their own cultural frameworks and added specific features. Similar procedures were at work during the period of the 1970s and 80s and 90s with the eclectic neo and retro avant-garde artistic characteristics. While interpreting some cases, I will focus on the issues related to the center versus periphery, universal versus particular, and international versus local or traditional. Stephen Mosbach raised them in the opening pages of a very interesting book, Modern Art in Eastern Europe, from the Baltic to the Balkans, which was published in 1999. I quote him, "Why is that today these avant-garde figures and movement, which earlier in the century overcame their peripheral location to assume a critical and formative role in the genesis of advanced art, are almost totally forgotten and overlooked?" End of his quotation. According to my belief, Mosbach touches the raw nerves of the following problematics. How to undo a persistent domination of Western narratives, a procedure in which Western cultural framework of museums and other institutions selects items from Central and Eastern Europe, or does not select items from Central and Eastern Europe, as Alexandra was speaking about, in order to repackage and reinterpret them in order to include them in the vertical history of Western art. Let us start with the historical avant-gardes. The stormy period of the historical avant-gardes in the geographical basin of Slovenia, Croatia and Serbia during the period 1910-1930 witnessed several waves of artistic, cultural and political movements with typical Central European avant-garde features. The avant-gardes tried to establish new centers of the avant-garde that could decentralize the artistic maps of Europe. Their aim was to persuade the German, mostly, and Italian West that unknown Slavic territory of avant-gardes exists. The historical avant-gardes thus revolted against asymmetry of international artistic lines of force. Thus they were criticizing a bourgeois west of Europe, the Occident, as Micic named it. According to them, the new avant-garde would rather, or new avant-garde order could introduce a specific asymmetry described by the Zenitist Micic in his 1921 Manifesto of Zenitism. I quote him: "Do close the gate, East, North and Central Europe, barbarians are coming. Do close the gate, but we are going to enter anyway." In a way, Oliver Frljić is repeating his sentences in, for example, in performances he does in Germany, like Balkan macht frei and things like that. So basically, he's repeating the procedures of the historical avant-garde as a representative of today's, let us say, politicized art. August Černigoj, the founder of Tank magazine, agreed with his close collaborator Micic that the old Europe should make room for new. In his 1927 Tank manifesto, Černigoj criticized the European canons and argued that, I quote, "Europe must fall into overbearing egoism, subconscious individualism, free terrorism. Our striving begins where European decadence stops forever." So we see that the attitude was very specific, and it was basically trying, this is the title of the new stage, the magazine they published with, Černigoj published with Delak, that they wanted to change in a way the history of the avant-garde and art and the axis of center and periphery. The main early avant-garde movements in Slovenia was constructivism that included works of and actions by painters and other artists, and of course the influence of, as we discussed it yesterday with some colleagues, the influence of futurism. Italian futurism was inevitable. Basically, it was the area in which most of the Slovene artists were working, based in, around Trieste, Gorizia, Friuli, Venezia, Giulia. So futurism was the most influential, or the closest avant-garde around Slovenia. And the first futurist, of course, Serata of Marinetti, was deliberately chosen to be in Trieste because it was politically most vulnerable city of Austrian Empire at the time. When Delak published the 2 issues of his avant-garde review, Tank, he molded them on the Zenit magazine, which was also the publication with an international orientation. Some of the texts he obtained from Micic, who after his imprisonment in Zagreb and release, the person who helped him to get released was Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, and was living in exile in Paris. At that time, same time, Delak persuaded Walden in Berlin to devote a special issue of his journal, Der Sturm, basically to, of course, junge slowenische Kunst. And to see some of the statements or manifestative statements which were published in Tank, we can read this one, which was written by August Černigoj. He wrote, "Constructivism is a Slavic avant-garde movement that will make a bridge of the artistic civilization between Europe and Balkans, the very continent of the young, strong race." So here we see the influence of Ljubomir Micic and his Barbaro genius and his concept of the Balkan avant-garde, which is going to free the European avant-garde art. And here we have the Sturm issue, which was dedicated to junge slowenische Kunst. And again, we have a play of words and ideologies with neue slowenische Kunst, who deliberately call themselves, because of Sturm and junge slowenische Kunst, neue slowenische Kunst. The whole movement was Neue Slowenische Kunst. And so we see that the two movements are very, very much linked. In his book, The European Avant-Gardes, Sasha Bru highlights the Slovene structuralism as an interesting example of the Central and European avant-gardes. His thesis is that the painter August Černigoj and theatre reformer Ferdo Delak introduced their own distinct variant of constructivism. In his views, this variant was, I quote Sasha, rather eclectic and hybrid, further borrowing elements from Expressionism and Dada, and thus fusing the need for destruction, typical of these movements, with the call for constructive, clearly voiced by constructivism. And this was something which is a feature of most of the avant-gardists, also a feature of the biggest poet, of the probably one of the most influential poets at that time, Srećko Kosovel, who took the imagery of futurism and other artistic movements, but then basically combined them with his own statement on the future of art, which was basically leftist statement. To continue, Slovene constructivism was thus coupled to a distinct regional concern because its combination of language clearly suggested that work from minor cultures equaled that of major former imperialist culture, like those of Germany, Great Britain, France, Austria, or Spain. So we see that Sasha Bruback is very specific in his dealing with the avant-garde because he's basically working in the center of the Western thought about the avant-garde, but he's coming from the East, basically. His origins are from the East, so he understands much better than most of his colleagues from Leuven how the avant-garde landscape was, what it looked like in the 1920s. But at the same time, the avant-garde circles in Central and Eastern Europe, specifically in Austria-Hungarian, Slovenia, multicultural, Trieste and its Slavic background of Ljubljana and Zagreb, so to say, were constantly on the move. They had to work in a very different circumstances and were often quite skeptical about European way of life. Let us remember some lines from Srećko Kosovel. I mentioned before. For example, from one of his Konz poems, I quote, "Europe is dying in a red light," or "Europe is stepping into the grave." So basically he had very strong statements about Europe, which he linked, of course, to the idea of the revolution, which was not clearly the Russian October Revolution, but it was the ideal of the revolution. But by the end of the 1920s, the political tensions in Europe were disturbing the development of the avant-gardes, and when in January 1929 Yugoslavia became a dictatorship with the aim of accelerating national cultural unification, Trieste was already deeply involved in the Italian fascist ideologies. In such political circumstances, the artists were committed to socially engaged art and literature. The open situation, so typical for the first years following World War I, with all options available, ended both in Yugoslavia and Italy. The avant-garde dream seemed to evaporate and the new war was slowly approaching. We see, so this we used before. Now we will skip, we will come to the Neue Slowenische Kunst later on, and this is in an interesting portrait of Delak also, and we will go to the neo-avant-gardes. Now, we shortly saw Dragan Živadinov, who's the icon of Neue Slowenische Kunst, but we will move now to the neo-avant-gardes, the case of Vlado Kralj, Glej and Pekarno. This is one of the early interviews of Vlado Kralj, I think in 1972, when he returned from New York, where he worked with Schechner and his performance group. He did 2 performances also with the actors of Richard Schechner, and he founded first the Glej Theater, and then because it was together with Dusan Jovanović, but then he realized the Glej Theater was not radical enough, and he founded a new glade, which we call Pekarna or the bakery. And this is a very interesting broadcast in the premises of Pekarna, or the old bakery, in which he explains his idea of an environmental theater, his idea of theater. The interview was done immediately after his first performance of Dane Zajc's second play, The Pathwalker, which was very ritual. Let us move to the time of the neo-avant-gardes and the performative turn in the 1970s, to the dramaturg, theater director and theoretician Lado Kralj, a key figure in Slovenian experimental theater. His early creative career is still somehow shrouded in a mystery, but is no less fascinating for it. After returning from New York, where he was an assistant to Richard Schechner in 69 and 70 season, and independently prepared one of the performances with Schechner's group, he co-founded two of the most groundbreaking experimental theaters I mentioned before. By the end of the 1970s, he had transitioned from the highly creative fringe of the Slovenian theatrical semiosphere to the very center, becoming the artistic director of Ljubljana National Theatre, but just for 2 years he was ejected, so to say, from it because of the politics at the end of the decade. After returning from a year of postgraduate studies with Professor Schechner in New York, Kralj brought with him first-hand knowledge about Jerzy Grotowski's concept and the American avant-garde theater. This included its leftist spirit and post-Brechtian orientation, as well as critique of bourgeois theater. Here we see a picture of the Pathwalker, the first representation, and here in the middle of the picture we have another very interesting figure of Slovene comparative literature, Janez Vrečko, who was at that time studying theater acting at the academy, and later he did not finish the studies because he went to the group of Eugenio Barba. So this is very interesting. We have two Slovene comparative literature scholars who are both of them probably one of the two most outstanding, who were both very much engaged for in a certain period of their lives with the neo-avant-gardes. And this is, of course, this was a very, very interesting production. We cannot go into details. He staged the first, the premiere of Pekarna was the Pathwalker, an unconventional and radical post-dramatic adaptation of Dane Zajc's play. Influenced by Grotowski's group theater and Schechner's environmental theater, Kralj set ritual and a collective as foundation for his new theater. He was interested in class theater, as he named it, as aesthetic action, which is very close to what Rancière might call aesthetic revolution, of a specific group, in this case a subculture. A significant aspect of Kralj's thinking at that time was the concept of alternative theater, which he formulated in an interview of some of the magazines. Right after his return from US, he argued that alternative theater was not characterized by a desire to be, I quote, better and more progressive than traditional theater, but rather it was, I quote, theater as aesthetic action, as ritual, as articulation of the unutterable. In the same interview, Kralj defined ritual as an event where there are no significant distinctions between performers and participants, where time is not strictly defined and which cannot be fully rationally explained but can be more deeply understood emotionally, attempting to find a symbolic correlate to essential preoccupation of the group it is intended for. It's end of quotation. Following this, here we have, before we had a picture of Pekarna from outside, and this is also a very interesting historical picture. It's also from Slovene TV. On the left side we have Mojca Kreft, the dramaturg, and of Pekarna theater, and here we have Lado Kralj a few years later. to proceed. And this is another interesting picture of another performance with simultaneous stage, which is a performance Kako, which was directed and conceived by Ljubiša Ristić, who joined Pekarna and was supposed to do also the adaptation, the first adaptation of the Tom for Boris Davidovich of Danilo Kiš, but performance never took place. It was moved later to Mladinsko. It could not take place because of the politics, and Pekarna had to end in '78. But as you see, it's also a very, very interesting concept of the neo-avant-garde, which is in a way which starts from the concepts of Schechner, but it adapts them or translates them into the Slovene or Yugoslav reality of that time. Following the lead of Schechner and the American avant-garde, Kralj assembled a group of 8 non-professional actors, students of comparative literature and Academy of Theatre, with the aim to explore, I quote, the phenomenon of plays as social action and the basis of theoretical creation, and the study of ritual as the optimal form of play. Like Schechner, Kralj's ritual theatre forms emerged from a radical critique of industrial society, which he saw as depriving individuals of the experience and wholeness, organic growth, concreteness and transcendental or religious experience. On the other hand, similar to Grotowski, Kralj grounded the ideology of ritual theatre and an inward focus, emphasizing the theatre's development and therapeutic experience, which was very important for him, which was geared toward the collective process of creation that transcended the logic of performance as a mere product. He was more interested in the process itself, the experimentation, the essence of acting and human mimicry, and the relationship between the physical and the psychological. Of course, here we see this is another performance, a performance of Gilgamesh, which was directed by Ivo Svetina, who used to be director of Slovene Theatre Museum for quite some time also, and who was a member of Popilja group, and later he co-founded with Lava Kralj the Pekarna Theatre. From what we see, we can really clearly see that Kralj basically took or reinterpreted the ideas of basically the ideas of Schechner, but also a lot the ideas of Grotowski, and really tried to change the paradigm of Slovene theatre. He did not really succeed. I mean, he could succeed, but because of different circumstances, he ended his career at the beginning of the 80s. He ended his career within theatre, and he became theatre scholar, a very good theatre scholar, an excellent theatre scholar, who did not talk really a lot about his, unfortunately, about his experimental experience with theatre. We both know with Gaspar that he talked, but he really did not write a lot about it. In some of the interviews, especially the interviews our colleague Primož Jesenko did with him, later on, Diana Kulini, later on, he related to his period. So this was very interesting. If we want to interpret it in relation to center and periphery, he basically he changed the idea of center and periphery, and he deliberately moved to New York to work with Schechner. He worked in the periphery, at that time really at the center of theatrical avant-garde, and then he reinterpreted the ideas of Grotowski and Schechner and used them very well in the Slovene and Yugoslav context. And of course, he was, in this sense, similarly to Dusan Jovanović, he was also, with Pupilja, he was very influential. If we just think about, for example, one of the most interesting theoreticians of contemporary performing and other arts, Miško Šovaković. Miško Šovaković, for example, writes in a few passages of his books how this art really, or the concept of new art really influenced his generation also. And of course also we can see the generation of Ljubiša Listić. And let us move now to the last period, to the retro avant-garde, the term which was elaborated by curators Weibel, Gross, Marina Gržinić, Inke Arns and the others. So this is the art of the 1980s and 1990s. They were inspired by artistic concepts. Here we have another picture of, and some posters of Pekarna. And then, so you see the building was quite small. And now we move to Neue Slowenische Kunst, of course with the passports of Neue Slowenische Kunst, but we will not talk about the passports, we will talk about East Art Map, which was already discussed during our symposium. The East Art Map was created by Irving Group, which is a fine arts group of Neue Slowenische Kunst, and in collaboration with Piotrowski and his thoughts. With its international artists and scholar collaborators, Irving was working on a new East Art Map that would include artists from Eastern European peripheries, something even, sometimes even forgotten territories. While doing so, the project established some basic interpretation and criticism of the Western centralism that used the concept of horizontal art history developed by Piotrowski by using a specific deconstruction of vertical art history, that is the history of the Western art. Here we have see this is the record of music group Leibach for the performance Baptism under Triglav, which was the inauguration of the Neue Slowenische Kunst in Slovenian culture. The Eastern European retro-avant-gardists and theoreticians attempted to realize the Western art history and place it next to other art historical narratives. In accordance with the horizontal paradigm, the avant-garde movements enabled them to reverse the traditional view of the relationship between the art history and the margins, and that our art history becomes something which is visible. In fact, what they were doing went hand in hand with the philosophical interventions of the Slovene philosopher Slavoj Žižek, which are dated more recently, claiming that a specific political autonomy exists in East and Central Europe even today. He elaborated, namely Slavoj Žižek, his thoughts in a non-formal manner in his lecture at the MoMA New York Museum, describing the specificity of radical avant-garde in Eastern Europe. This is one of the rare occasions where he really speaks about the specificity of Eastern Europe in relation to the art, because he doesn't speak a lot about the Eastern European art. So when he states, so what I ask is, why is East European experience so important? Because now the big opposition is first world versus third world. Build a capitalist metropolis versus undeveloped, exploited, economically colonized countries. And then he finishes his thoughts, Žižek, I think we need the eccentric position, which is the position of the Eastern and Central Europe. So my message is that we are not here to learn from you, from the people from New York. Instead, you should learn from us. We should be because we should be absolutely avant-garde. So basically, he reverses the situation, and in this way, he speaks about the necessity of changing the perspective which is the vertical perspective. Using his eccentric position of the enfant terrible of today's materialist philosophy, Žižek speaks also in the name of the exploited and colonized art markets of the East and Central European periphery. His thoughts are not far from those of the Irving Group and their contemporaries that realized that even after the fall of the Berlin Wall and in the beginning of the 21st century, we're still living in the art world defined by the East-West or center-peripheric logic. From the centers in the West, particular models come to the periphery. The art of the periphery was supposed to adapt the models established in the centers. And the periphery revolted with MSK and other movements, and basically the situation in a way is still changing to different perspective, which could be described as a weak avant-garde, as a horizontal perspective of avant-gardes, and so on and so on. So this is an interesting picture of the Neue Slowenische Kunst, I think in 1980s, I think it's part of the scenography of baptism under Triglav. It's the Tatlin's monument to the Third International, and they're basically all took a photo as the heirs of the historical avant-garde. To slowly conclude, how did the new avant-garde fulfill the utopian ideas of the avant-gardes? Thus it can be said that the wheel of history fulfilled some of the utopian ideas of the historical avant-gardes at the end of the 20th century. The neo and post-avant-gardes or retro-avant-gardes reenacted some basic ideas of the constructivist and futurist utopian questions raised by the avant-gardes. The new generations were proud to announce that they are the heirs of the artistic generation of the constructivists like Černigoj, that wanted to promote Ljubljana as a center of the new art, to establish a new bridge between the East and the West, which spoke about the bridge between Occident and Orient, which is also nice, or in a highly futurist and constructivist metaphor, Ljubljana was, like Černigoj wrote, a garage of the fast-paced world of beauty, a center from which pilots prepare to fly around the world by means of mental machines. So this is very futuristic imagery, which is used in another leftist and constructivist context. This metaphor has to be understood in the sense of the zenith tongue avant-garde notions of the rebirth arriving from the barbarian southeast, their attempt to revolt against what Marian Dovic, our colleague who researches a lot the avant-garde, mainly in literature, this defines as asymmetry of international artistic lines of force, an attempt to revolutionize the periphery-centre relationship. The Slovene constructivists and Serbian zenithists were united by a thought about this asymmetry, described with a specific Balkan black humor by Micic in his manifesto. I quoted before, barbarians are coming, do close the gates, but we are going to enter anyway. In this sense, what Micic, Delek and Černigoj did had to be seen as a radical attempt to redefine centrality and marginality, to show how, using the argumentation of Diana Miškova, margins do not merely exist as extensions of the core. The artists from the East Central European Europe acted in a sense of Lotman's margins with dynamics within the semiosphere. The relation between margins and centers of the semiosphere of the avant-gardes can be described as a spatial-temporal phenomenon, a combination of different tendencies from east and west, south and north, that are in constant dialogue with one another, creating semiotic languages which are not a simple sum of individual systems, but are characterized by a dynamic interactivity. The artists discussed deliberately chose not to play the role of the supporters of Western narratives and the artificial contexts within which Western institutions present their peripheral art as something never or very rarely taken in its entirety, Thus they're opting for a specific interpretation of the identity of other cultures and productions within eliminating them without eliminating them with the one-sided and already formed view of the dominant culture. Thus they're mapping a new East-Art map, a new alternative horizontal geography and history of art. So this would be